Cloud9 have removed their head coach Mithy ahead of the 2024 Summer Split, and they have replaced him with Reapered. Now, I want to first discuss Mithy as a head coach first before we get into Reapered. Now, Mithy was obviously a support player back in Europe, previously with the likes of Origin before, which was XPeke's team, and then of course you had G2, where he was a support as well for all those great, phenomenal teams, especially playing with perks. And then he went over to TSM as a support where it didn't quite work out, but then he moved over as a coach, and then he got quarters at Worlds 2020 with Fnatic, then went over to C9 and won 2021 LCS Spring. He got quarters at 2021 Worlds, quarters at MSI 2021, and then he won Spring of 2023. So his resume is quite impressive. I don't think anyone would argue that. But obviously, Cloud9 has had some problems here for the 2024 Spring Split, not looking that cohesive as a team, and obviously getting upset over and over again in playoffs. So let's start with the whole premise that Jack created a super team. This is probably, I think, one of the weakest super teams that we've seen in the history of the LCS. When you think of Team Liquid, I think Team Liquid's super team was stronger than this one on paper. And then you had TSM super team, I believe that was in 2017, I want to say. And that super team was also better on paper. But okay, we're going with the theory that this is a super team. Well, as we all know, super teams largely fail, and the reason for that is because they just aren't on a fundamental basis and cohesive level. Once you get outside of their mechanics as players, it doesn't really work out from there. And previously, I did a video about Team Liquid's super team and why that failed, and basically the gist of it was that I don't think that team specifically was able to get the fundamentals down of how to actually play the game. Now, for Cloud9, I actually don't think it's really that. Their fundamentals as far as how the early game goes and things like that is actually pretty good. But towards the mid game and late game, this team had a lot of obvious problems, such as even how to do things like team fighting or lane assignments or simple macro things. They just really weren't up to snuff. And additionally, of course, everyone is going to point to their draft. So by all means, what I am kind of curious on is that most people say that the GM is kind of at fault for creating a super team to begin with. So why aren't people outraged that Jack created a super team and, oh, yeah, what do you know? The super team fucking failed. I think some amount of blame should be put towards Jack for the situation that Cloud9 is currently in. Anything below, I think, second place is an utter failure for Cloud9. Obviously, first place should be considered, or anything below first place should be also considered a failure, but we'll take it light and say second place. So they even failed to get that as well. They failed to get to the finals of the LCS Spring Split. Now, the caveat that I will give Jack, and I think a lot of people should give this or are currently giving this to him, which is why they think that this super team is acceptable, is because all of the players have played with each other at some level or another, right? JoJo and Vulcan obviously have played together, and then the rest of Cloud9 have played together as well. So you would think initially that the team shouldn't have many hurdles to get through. As I said, with the problem with Team Liquid is, and the problem with a lot of super teams, is that you have to get the fundamentals at the same level, because a lot of people assume that with a super team, everyone's just going to be on the same page. You don't have to go over very simple things like how to do different ward placements on the map and exactly where you want your ward coverage, when you should be at specific points on the map for certain objectives, cross map plays, and, you know, simple things that you guys should already kind of know to begin with, that those weren't really happening on Team Liquid. But with Cloud9, you would think those fundamentals have already been, kind of laid out. And I think to a fair extent, they had been laid out, besides the whole cross map and things like that. But the team fighting was mostly their biggest issue, along with their drafting, I would say. But the big caveat of it all is that, yes, this team was expected to work together because they have worked together before. So you can at least give that caveat to Jack. But the kind of Freudian slip there, right, with the Jat and Jack. But the big thing that I would call out for this coaching staff, and the reason why I would put some significant amount of blame on Jack, other than creating a super team, which is kind of dumb to begin with, is that the budget for the coaching staff is clearly non-existent. Jack spent all of his money on the actual superstars of, the roster itself, and then he just kind of skimped out on the coaching staff. You have Mithy as the head coach, and then you have Veigar V2, who isn't even there in person. He's the remote coach, and he's like a positional / draft / analyst coach, right? And then previously, you also had a kind of budget roster with LS when he was a coach, right? But now LS took most of the money. Obviously, you have to pay LS an exorbitant amount of money in order for him to be the coach. And then you had Max Waldo as the positional coach. But then they also had Revan as their academy coach for Cloud9, because Cloud9 had an academy team back in the day. But now they currently don't. So that's one less coach that you have on staff. And not only that, but LS also had a physical coach there in Max Waldo. So Mithy is working with a lot less in terms of resources, and it's seemingly that Jack spent all of his money on the actual roster itself. And we all know for 2024, it's been the great esports winter that everyone's been talking about, where all the teams have a limited amount of sponsorship money, they have limited amount of revenue to begin with from, the LCS, and so everyone's going towards a budget type scenario. We saw it with how shitty the bottom half of the LCS actually is as far as rosters and things like that. Although, they tried to make do with what they could, and some of them got some good pieces. Shout out to Shopify with Bvoy. But it's clear that Cloud9 had a very slim budget for their coaching staff. So I would put that on Jack. I think Jack just kind of needs to own up to that and say, okay, yeah, we did run a little bit slim, and we didn't give Mithy the tools to succeed. I think that's completely fair to say. So for, Cloud9 fans that are saying Mithy is such a shitty coach and really he didn't know what he was doing or whatever, you have to consider that he was working with a limited coaching staff. So don't put all the blame on Mithy. I'm not saying that, Mithy did everything correct on his time with Cloud9. There certainly were some dodgy drafting, but don't put it all on him. Speaking of drafting, people then are pointing towards Degon's video. He had an interview with Mithy and Revan after a match between the two, and they were talking about draft and how it was kind of a wacky draft from Cloud9, and they got beat, obviously. And we'll go ahead and watch part of that clip right now.
We haven't I haven't worked with Jojo that long. I don't know exactly what he plays. There were 2 mid lane bans on the first phase, and we couldn't find the champion that he had played and that he felt confident on to do damage.
So what a lot of Cloud9 fans are honing in that clip is that Mithy had said he doesn't really know JoJo's champion pool. And everyone's like, well, how do you not know a player's champion pool? You're the fucking coach of the team. How do you not know your own player's champion pool? Well, first of all, this is kind of towards the beginning of the split. But secondly, I don't think fans realize that first, players have secret picks. You have picks that you have never even shown on stage, and maybe you've shown in scrims. Mithy doesn't know that. Mithy doesn't know what kind of secret picks that you have. So that's a part of the champion pool that you cannot know as a coach heading into a new roster, right? Secondly, there's stated preferences versus revealed preferences. I think we all know this from the psychology field itself, where people say that they like, someone with a great personality, but really they like that banging ass, right? Well, that's the case here, not the banging ass, is that there are stated preferences that a player might make, and they might say, yes, I'm good on this champion, this champion, this champion, this champion. But really, in fact, they aren't good on that champion. They're okay on another champion. And yeah, two out of the four that they say they're good at, they're actually quite good at. So it's an objective measurement of you saying from the third party perspective, oh, okay, here's what he said. Now let's actually see if that's the truth. That's something that you have to pick through as a head coach. So it's obvious if you're a new head coach, headed into someone that you haven't ever coached before with Jojo Pyun, you actually don't really know his champion pool. Stated preferences versus revealed preferences. You have to figure out his champion pool. Now, as far as the draft itself goes, now, yes, there were some terrible drafts from Cloud9. I don't think anyone would argue otherwise. But what's kind of weird with Cloud9's drafting itself is it does feel like they kind of just willy-nilly picked picks on the day of the draft. It's as if they didn't have a committed draft plan. Now, I think that does largely fall on Mithy in instilling the kind of responsibility that these players have and committing to a draft beforehand. You should be able to sit all of your players down and say, okay, these are the picks, that we think that they're going to pick. Here are the picks that we're good at. What are we going to play? And what do we think the reactions are between, draft A, draft B, and draft C of what the enemy picks? Then you have a draft plan that you figure out, and it's all kind of pre-prepared. So, and really, all of these coaches and analysts and following the meta, you kind of know what's already going to happen anyways. I mean, you see all of these co-streamers, someone like Cage-Roll can go through and watch a draft, and they could see, and they can immediately call out what's probably going to be picked next. They're like, oh, it's going to be, Renekton R2 or some shit. And you'll be pretty spot on. It's not that difficult once you watch a lot of different games. So therefore, you can make a committed draft plan. And I don't think Cloud9 necessarily had that. Now, I think that points to the fact that Mithy might have not had as much control as people would normally think a head coach should have during the draft. And that's why it got all fucked up and looked all wonky on a lot of different occasions. So yeah, I would agree that's probably a big fault of Mithy and how he wasn't able to take charge of the players during the draft phase. Additionally, let's also discuss how poorly Vulcan played during 2024. He did not look great at all. There were a lot of instances where he would get caught out, or he would just get completely smashed in lane. On top of that, Berserker obviously didn't look well next to him, so like both of these parts of the bot lane were just kind of a liability for pretty much the entire split, besides the playoffs where they kind of started to shore that up. Berserker more than Vulcan. I don't know why I was thinking of Mithy. But I think you should also remember what I said about Vulcan and the fact that I said in my preview of Cloud9's entire roster that this is the second time that he's played with a Korean ADC. The first time that he played with it was with Piglet, and that did not work out well. They were great in the laning phase, but then after that, they were kind of shit. And now you see here, Vulcan is having trouble with a Korean ADC as well. So it's clear that I think Mithy should have been able to help navigate Vulcan in terms of acclimating to Cloud9 and Berserker himself, but he just clearly couldn't do that. You would think that Mithy could do that given he was a former, professional support himself. So I think that's another fault of Mithy, that he is a direct correlation and direct access to his support player and can give him tips, yet he was probably one of the worst players on the entire Cloud9 lineup as far as the regular split. Now, as a whole and as Cloud9 culture, and you have to think what would have went wrong so far for Cloud9, as their gameplay was shit and all of them are really good players, so that shouldn't be the case. And it was more so that they would only win games through stomping lane, so just by brute forcing and through hands. And that kind of points to their ideas of not having great conflict resolution about how to play the game as a team. Because really, in the laning phase, it's just the laning phase. It's kind of like solo queue. You just try and beat the enemy, and it doesn't require that much team communication as far as who you need to coordinate with on the map. Now, that then points towards their problems in the mid game and late game, where obviously they weren't able to gel together, and also their cohesion in draft. Obviously, there were some very bad picks in draft. So that points to conflict resolution. Now, as a player, I think it's much different to have conflict resolution versus a coach. Now, you think of Mithy, I always point towards his conflict resolution in TSM. There was like some famous clip basically with Mithy calling everybody out and saying, hey, look, like, we need to solve these problems or else we're not going to go anywhere and we're not going to win anything. So I'd rather be the fucking bad guy and call out all this shit of what we're doing wrong. We point out each other's flaws and then we go from there rather than just pussyfooting around shit, right? And I'm obviously paraphrasing here. But that's something that you can say as a player, but as a coach, you have to navigate that situation entirely different. So maybe it's not the fact that Mithy really has those skills to do conflict resolution as a coach versus as a player. That might be one aspect. But the other aspect, and I'm pretty sure this is for sure, is that he has no good cop, bad cop dynamic on his team because his other coach is somewhere over in fucking Europe, Vigar V2. He's a remote coach. So he has no one to play good cop, bad cop with, which is the most efficient way to do a coaching system by far, is you have one person who's kind of an asshole and one person who's like the really good guy, and that's, for the players and whatnot. So Mithy had no one else to bounce that situation and create that culture with. So can you really blame Mithy for having a lack of cohesion on his team and the ability to lead his team if he didn't have any other person on the coaching staff in order to bounce that diode, that magnet of North and South Pole together to create a good team environment? I think you place that on Jack more than anyone else. Now, let's get on to Reapered joining this lineup. Previously, I know you all know who Reapered is. He previously coached for Cloud9 and won a whole bunch of championships, of course. And Reapered actually went over to Japan for 2023. And he was coaching and he was at some actual C-level position within Japan for a esports team called Sengoku Gaming for 2023, which, by the way, was also basically a full Korean roster. I didn't recognize any of those names on there other than Paz, who was the top laner for them, who is actually Japanese. But what you have to remember, I think Reapered actually didn't win anything. He got like second place or third place a lot of the time. But you have to remember in Japan that It's basically a one-team region. Detonation Focus Me is the team of Japan. They're the best team. They've been the best team for a really long time. And the only team that could ever challenge Dead FM was actually a team called Rampage back in, I think they existed, their last team was in like 2017. And after that, there's been no other team that has been able to contest Dead FM. It's only been Rampage in the past, and that was it. That was back in 2017. So I wouldn't hold any results against Reapered. I think he probably did fine for what that region could actually do. Now, as far as Reapered coming into Cloud9, it's a great choice, obviously. If you have a team full of huge ego, then yeah, like Reapered is the one to break player egos and say, no, this is what's exactly going to happen. And we all remember he broke the player egos of someone like Jensen and Sneaky when he decided to bench all the fucking Cloud9 players back in the day. So it's clear that if you want someone with a belt, that's not Coma, then you get Reapered. Now, they're also bringing over a player from the LCK called Thanatos, who is playing for the top lane. He's going to be replacing Fudge. I'm not really going to comment on all of that because I don't really know that player. I don't watch Challengers League for LCK, so I'm not going to fucking pretend that I know who this guy is, nor am I going to pretend watching a couple highlight clips means that I know this player, right? I'm not one of those fake analysts. But we'll talk about drafting as far as Reapered's concerned. I think if you're looking at Cloud9 and you see one of the biggest weaknesses for this team is the draft, which it is, then Reapered is probably one of the best coaches that you can get. And that's disregarding that he was even in the Cloud9 system before. But if you include that, that's also a bonus of why you should pick Reapered to begin with. But one of Reapered's biggest strengths, I think, is his drafting, because he seems to have so much control over what the players are picking that he creates an actual draft identity, which is a huge problem of what's happening with Cloud9. It doesn't seem like they have a draft identity or a plan going into it, nor do they understand their team composition's win conditions, even if they do draft something that is very cohesive. So with Reapered at the helm, I think that will shore up a lot of the weaknesses of Cloud9. Now, that is to be said, though, will they be able to shore up their mid/late game? That's something that only Reapered and the coaching staff can answer from there. But let's also consider what I talked about previously, which is that Mithy was the only guy on staff. Well, now it's going to be Reapered is the only guy on staff. Assuming, right, we only know that Reapered was signed and we don't know if they actually signed an assistant coach or anything like that. But as far as the news is right now, that's who they've signed. Now, Reapered as a standalone coach, I actually think he has enough balls and enough control over players that him being alone by himself is probably a fine idea. Now, previously, when I talked about Cloud9's lineup and their roster, I had said that, okay, Mithy can kind of be the guy that's the person with all the analytics and can kind of be a little bit harsh. But then you have Hai as the team manager. Yes, I know he's not the assistant coach or anything. He's more the team manager and just there helping out the players, making all the schedule, things like that, making sure that they're well and they're doing okay. But I thought he could also be the good cop of the entire situation, even though he's not really a coach and that's not what he's supposed to be doing. But here with Reapered, I think Reapered's going to be able to have such an iron fist that maybe Hai can actually fulfill that role to some degree of being a good cop and saying, look, I know Reapered's an asshole, but you got to listen to him. He's your coach. And Reapered has the balls enough to be the asshole. But not only that, Reapered has a high kind of, I guess, idea about the game and philosophy about the game. He has axioms about the game, something that I consistently talk about within the League of Legends space, and how I don't think a lot of coaches or players, for that matter, have axioms or philosophies about the game, Reapered certainly does, and you can certainly see it through his drafts and how his teams play. So overall, I actually like this pickup. I think it makes a lot of sense if you're going to stick with a similar lineup. And he has an upgrade in the top lane with a Korean player who now, with the top lane being Korean and the ADC being Korean, yeah, it does make a lot of sense to get Reapered as a head coach. So all in all, I do agree with this move, but it's still largely a super team in and of itself. But with Reaper at the helm, who of course has coached very high profile players and has broken them down and created a system that they must abide by, he's certainly a great coach. So I expect Cloud9 to actually be able to turn this ship around for the summer split.